Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the session today. I think most people in this audience, if you're working in the HR function, you probably face one of the fundamental questions: is the workforce you have the one that you need? And while we certainly operate in uncertain times, coming out of a global pandemic, certainly there's economic uncertainty. There's still the fundamental challenges that, the workforce that we knew today is very different than the workforce prior pandemic. And the organizational skills that you needed prior to the pandemic are very different than the ones that you need today. We have an opportunity. We do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum at Skillsoft. I actually sit on the Skills Link Alliance. There's some interesting research that they've conducted over the years. A few years ago, they had actually conducted a study that suggested that 50% of employees will need reskilling in the next 3 to 5 years. And that most business leaders expect that their workforce is going to learn new skills on the job. But the question is, what are those skills? What are those roles? And what we always really find very interesting when we look at this research is that 8 of the top 10 roles are not all that surprising. They're the things that you hear about every day. They're analytics, design thinking, cybersecurity, AI, machine learning. I don't think that list surprises anyone. But what's striking is when you look at the top 10 skills that are growing, 8 of the top 10 are actually human skills. They're power skills. It's critical thinking. It's problem solving. It's communication. It's leadership. And so one could actually look at this data and say, really, what we're observing is that certainly the roles are transforming, the technologies are transforming, what's needed to be successful is transforming, but what's also transforming, what's important is that people have the human skills, the power skills to make all those technologies effective. And especially in the world that we live in today that's distributed, it still continues to be virtual, the ability to support and drive collaboration, to lead effectively, to have emotional intelligence, to really connect with people has never been more important. So that puts a unique challenge for all of you who work in the HR space, some of you that work in the learning space. How do you actually drive both technology proficiency as well as the human skills that are required to execute on that? In a world where you need to transform, in many cases, you need to transform tens of thousands of employees each year. We conduct an annual IT skills and salary survey, and I found this particular observation, quote, to be interesting, is that, career growth opportunities tend to be one of the most important factors in retention of your workforce. The fact that they believe and understand that there's a path for them to growth. And what's interesting is that your employees' aspirations are not completely removed or independent from what your organization or the enterprise's objectives are, right? In many cases, your workforce may be seeking opportunities to become data scientists, become AI and machine learning engineers, become social media strategists, digital marketers. And you know what? Those happen to also be the growth skills that you need to drive for in your organizations as well. But the question is, how do you go about doing that? How do you actually merge together the career ambitions of your workforce with the skill gaps and the needs of your organization to drive performance? And the simple answer is there's no silver bullet to overcome that skills gap. And it kind of manifests really in 3 very discrete ways. And these are things that you'd all be aware of, but certainly onboarding. And it's not uncommon. Many of you who are sitting in the room today, you're faced with the challenge that you're going to need to onboard literally 20 to 25% of your workforce in the coming year. In some cases, we meet with customers, it's tens of thousands of people that they need to onboard. At the same point in time, you may actually be dealing with situations where you've got pockets of your workforce that have skills that have depreciated, that just aren't as relevant anymore. And how are you going to upskill or reskill those folks so they can be billable on the next project? And you find yourselves in situations where you have entire teams of people that really understand relational database design and maybe SQL or MySQL. And now they need to learn R, Python. They need to learn non-structured languages. And that's one example from technology, but it manifests all over the workforce as we see it. Simultaneously, there is an astonishing number of learning resources that are available today. And this is I won't go through every point on this graphic, but it basically makes the point that if you look at one axis, there's kind of highly critical project-driven skills that typically require kind of high-stakes outcomes, and then there's just ongoing performance support and learning in the flow of work. And you've got all sorts of learning interventions on the x-axis, right? Everything from virtual classes, boot camp, coaching, micro-learning on one end. And the question is, how do you actually take all these resources and federate them and actually curate them in such a way so they're meaningful to your workforce, that they see the opportunity, and that and as importantly, that your enterprise, that your executive stakeholders can actually, very quickly and obviously see the return on all this. So one approach that many organizations have adopted, and again, none of this will probably come as a surprise, is really investing in learning taxonomies. And what is a learning taxonomy? A taxonomy versus an ontology. Really, a taxonomy or an ontology is some level of classification system that allows you to group like pieces of data together in a way that kind of makes sense. And an ontology actually helps kind of describe that. But what many organizations are now investing in are robust skill ontologies that actually describe the workforce in a certain way, that actually allow you to basically identify skills and then roll them up into some sequence, into some hierarchy that's intuitive, that shows progression, that shows how your workforce will move through these particular journeys. Again, the World Economic Forum, there's a lot of work going on around a skills passport, which is really intended to be kind of the universal Rosetta Stone that will kind of define the skills index for all the growth occupations. And that's one example where you have organizations investing in defining that. And again, we meet with companies every day, and they're spending tremendous amounts of time and resource to look across their thousands of job descriptions, to abstract key themes, key competencies, what are the key roles, and assemble those into a hierarchy. But in either case, this notion of a taxonomy is becoming increasingly important. But what's becoming also increasingly important is that whatever taxonomy that you're building to describe the skills and capabilities of your workforce does not live in isolation from the rest of the market. So there's a lot of pressure on learning and talent organizations to make sure however you're describing your workforce in terms of skills, roles, proficiencies, capabilities aligns with how the market views that. So let's just talk about an example of kind of a role-based framework or taxonomy. This is the one that we use at Skillsoft. We do some work with Burning Glass. As many of you know, Burning Glass has an API that monitors over 18,000 skills. We abstract those, just for simplicity's sake, into kind of two basic domains: enterprise technology skills and future critical functional skills. And you can see in the enterprise technology space, you've got all the things that we saw on the first slide, things like cloud infrastructure, cybersecurity, DevOps, coding and programming. On the functional skills, it's everything from business analytics to customer experience, customer service, and a whole host of others. But this at least provides a starting point to actually look at your workforce, their skills, and then to start a way in which you can start planning a career. Now the question is, how do you take all this role-based and skill-based information and actually sequence it in a way that makes sense? There was a time, and I've been in the industry for about 20 years, and 10 years ago, there was a point of view that you could just put massive amounts of skill indexes out inside of learning and discovery portals, and people could take a miraculous assessment, and then you would be recommended a perfectly curated path. And typically what happened when organizations implemented those types of systems is you get a massive amount of noise. And you that sit in the talent functions and the learning functions, you would be dealing with the reality of your platforms, right? What could you actually curate? And you probably set up massive curation teams to actually sequence all these skills into something that could be usable. Well, the good news is many products, there's been many technologies that have come on the market that have simplified this dramatically. Again, we have one that we build, we call it Aspire. Is kind of our system of learning journeys that we sequence, but there's many other tools in the market that support that. But what's important is that you as an organization align on what are the skills that are important so you can sequence those into a hierarchy that makes sense. So let's look at how this actually manifests into what we call a career journey. So in this particular example, what we've taken is the cybersecurity domain, and we've actually categorized that taxonomy into generalist, specialist, and expert capabilities. But what's important here is not the fact that we've classified it, but that we actually put a didactic sequence into it, where there's a natural onboarding place where people can start as either a generalist or get the cyber foundations information that they need, those skills. and then work into more specialist paths like ethical hacking, forensic specialists, defense specialists. And then ultimately, as they get through those specialized roles, they can merge into the expert categories, and that's typically where we've curated things like open professional certifications like CACSP, CISM, CISA, to actually illustrate the credentials that people have. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, this seems pretty obvious, who wouldn't think about it this way? But the power of this is what I've laid out is a system of classification and a structure that's not only relevant to the learner, but it's also relevant to the enterprise. Said differently, if you can actually take your skill sets and your taxonomies and actually organize them in a way that makes sense, what I've actually created here is a natural career progression for your workforce, for your learners, for people that are interested in pursuing a career in cybersecurity. And more importantly, as I move through this journey and I complete these learning opportunities, what I'm actually building is also a case, an ROI case, for how I've actually improved the competency of my organization. And I can tell you, just having met with literally dozens of different world-class learning organizations, this is how people are actually thinking about this challenge and this opportunity. But the problem is that there's just so much data to sort through. Is how do you actually start? How do you begin? And so that's really where it comes down to looking at your workforce and really understanding the key themes and then actually aligning with a standardized index to think about that. And the thing I would say is that it's very hard to find perfection. I find that some organizations really get wrapped around the axle looking for the perfect taxonomy, trying to find the perfect definitions. But it's more realistic to get to kind of a common standard and implement from there. Again, we publish an annual learning trends report. We call it Lean Into Learning. We actually track through our own sets of journeys and competencies what the trending journeys are. And some of them aren't entirely role-based. We release ones that are more kind of thematic. In 2021, these were kind of our top 15 journeys and skill pathways that we saw emerging. So it was everything, interestingly, in the top 5, 3 of those were actually human skills, right? First-time manager, leadership development. But then we get into things like design thinking. Obviously building resilience in your personal life. That was a key theme, obviously, in 2021 and continues to be in 2022. And then you get into some of the technology skills here also in the top 10 or 15. So Python, Agile, so on and so forth. But again, this allows us to at least kind of track the skill movements through that taxonomy that I just described. So the next question is, once you've actually settled on what the taxonomy looks like and how that reflects your workforce, how do you actually drive mastery? How do you drive workforce transformation? And I would just suggest that a very common approach here is actually leveraging a blend of instructional models or instructional assets to drive mastery at scale. This is a very simple matrix that we leverage at Skillsoft to think about that. And so on the y-axis here on the left side of the table, you can see basic levels of proficiency. These are not unique to Skillsoft. These are common definitions: awareness, literacy, competency, proficiency, and mastery. And typically you're going to find, if you think back to our career architecture, driving competency, awareness, literacy, that's generally, on-demand self-study courses are generally pretty good to get people to a competent and conversant level of knowledge, right? You can do that at scale. And so you can actually meet that foundational, even getting into some of the more specialized skills through that domain. But ultimately, if you want people to achieve some level of proficiency and be billable and be able to go out and represent your company in front of a client, they need to become proficient. And the way they do that is through some level of hands-on practice. The most obvious example are things like hands-on practice labs, getting them into an environment where they can demonstrate their skills. They can actually go through some different scenarios and so forth. But it's not relegated to just technology skills. We actually do a lot of work with the coaching part of our organization, where you can set up interactions with coaches. You can set up individual and personal assignments where people can assess their team. They can actually build their own internal network, and they can review their progress with a coach. But that's a way to actually get them hands-on with the topic. Again, building their way to proficiency. Ultimately, to get people to mastery, they have to interact with a cohort. This is pretty well established here. But that cohort does not necessarily need to be a synchronous, contiguous 5-day environment. It can be an asynchronous experience, right? But ultimately, you want people to be able to collaborate around a given topic area, around a given subject as they actually work up their journey. And actually getting into that final kind of live cohort-based environment is how they actually are able to ask questions and actually achieve level of mastery. Again, nothing too revolutionary in this slide, but this is just an example of a blended curriculum and how these assets come together. And you can see, on the competency side, we have things like self-study courses that play through a traditional kind of course player. This is a screen cap from our LXP Percipio. You've got digital books, which are a great resource as people want to provoke their own curiosity and actually research more. As I get into proficiency, you can see here I've actually included an example of a practice lab. This particular example, I'm actually getting into a coding environment. And then I actually have exam preps where I can actually get more hands-on and demonstrating the knowledge. And then finally getting into mastery, this is some examples of virtual classrooms and some on-demand mentoring and coaching that are also helpful in that sequence. And again, some of this may be self-evident, but it's always good to show examples. So actually, after you're progressing someone on the journey, the next is how do you actually prove that they're actually learning things? And so a very common way to approach that is through basic skill-based assessments, right? Now, I will say that our approach to this has been more of a criterion-based assessment where we actually go back to our taxonomy, we abstract what the performance criteria are into learning objectives that can be tested, and actually then build the assessments from here. But we have a product we call skill benchmarks where in a 20-question assessment, we can assess someone's capability around a domain and then give them a score on from novice all the way up to proficient. But more importantly, what it does is actually recommends training for them to go back through in the event that they need to. Now, what's really helpful about this as an organization, regardless of whatever assessment tool that you use, is this gives you a way to kind of measure progress of the workforce, actually understand their capability and how they're actually moving through and actually building those skills. And there's a lot of great analytic tools out there that help you measure that and report out on that in, at scale. The biggest challenge is you don't want to be in a position where you're fabricating, kind of putting multiple tools together, and really it all comes back to that initial taxonomy that you define and how you actually define the performance levels. And I would just say that in this case, perfection can be the enemy of progress. It's better to get to a decent high-level abstraction that your executive team and your management are comfortable with as you're assessing and managing and measuring those things. And I guess, the other thing to keep in mind here, make sure that you're always measuring the most important and critical issues to your business. And then finally, how do you actually reward and incent your learners to actually pursue skill development? And so, again, we've built a capability around digital badges. This is certainly not necessarily unique to Skillsoft. We work with Accredible. There's other tools out there as well. But the most important themes when you think about credentialing and incenting people are two fundamental elements. Number one, you want to make sure that whatever you're creating in terms of a credential is truly resume worthy, right? It's something that someone's going to find value in their resume, in their market, and how they actually, represent themselves. We've actually adopted a standard, and we gathered some insights from IBM and others on how they've implemented digital badging. We actually adopted a stacked badge strategy. So we have things that happen at an individual skill level on a course. And so that's something like inside of 20, 25 minutes of training, you can get a micro-credential. We actually have things that are more kind of skill and role-based, if you complete an entire track. And ultimately, if you complete an entire domain, we award a badge for that as well. And so that allows the learner to kind of show and demonstrate progress, again, in things that are truly resume-worthy. The other second important element around any digital credential is that it's shareable, it's portable, right? That you actually have the ability to not only share that with your current set of colleagues, but you have the ability to have that credential persist post your tenure with your organization. Now, that may seem counterintuitive. You're, gosh, I'm investing in workforce development of my own people, of my own group. Why would I want to have them build all those skills so they could take them elsewhere? But ultimately, this is how you motivate people such that they will start to pursue and build the skills that are important to your enterprise by virtue of all the taxonomies that you've invested in. Again, very, very important. We found this to be a phenomenally important part of motivation. We issue over 1 million digital badges a month with our platform. So just to summarize, just a very simple path forward as you think about this. And again, this is not a revolutionary topic, but it's a concise way to actually think about and contextualize the platform. Ultimately, by aligning career aspirations with skill gaps, you can actually accelerate workforce transformation. But the first step is to actually define what that taxonomy, what your skill framework is, and really do that in simple business terms. Are the skills and roles for the future of your organization defined? Have you met with your executive stakeholders to define those? Are they truly critical to your organization? Do they find value in them? The next then is to really curate the journey and really do that from a learner's perspective. right? How do these skills actually cascade? How do they stack to actually become relevant to the learner so that they want to pursue that? And then finally, align the rewards, incentives of your program to that through either a digital badging or some type of credential, again, that can be resume worthy and that can be shared. It's been a pleasure to speak with all of you this morning. I'll be available in the hallway or at the SkillSoft booth, happy to answer any questions, but thank you so much for your time and attention today. Take care. Have a great conference.